Wyvern, an imaginary heraldic beast with the head and 4 feet of an eagle and the wings and tail of a dragon. The battle standard of Wessex since the time of King Arthur 1400 years ago, and the battle sign of the 43rd Wessex Division today.
This is the story of the Wessex Division in World War II, from June 1944 to May 1945. It will be seen sometimes as it actually happened 21 years ago, sometimes in the drawings and sketches of men who were on the spot, and sometimes as the scene appears today, 21 years afterwards.
The story will be told as far as possible in the words of the men who were there, men from Cornwall and Gloucestershire, Wiltshire, Dorset, Worcestershire and Somerset, Hampshire, men of all arms then, and of all walks of life today. Men of the Ordinary Territorial Infantry Division, 18,347 men from the West Country, organized into 3 brigades, each of 3 battalions.
We were members of the 43rd Wessex Division, which had spent all its time until the invasion in England. We had not seen any fighting.
Commanded by Major General G.I. Thomas, the division had trained vigorously for 2 years in England.
Major General G.I. Thomas knew as early as 21st February that his division was destined to be part of the follow-up element in the approaching invasion of France. We were to land about D+12, that is between June the 18th and 20th, with the task of breaking out of the bridgehead. At 6 p.m. on the 12th of June, the code word Mary placed the division at 6 hours' notice.
Many of the old hands in the division remembered the South Coast Assembly ports from 1940.
It was rather ironical, I think, in a way, that we spent so much of our time at New Haven in a defensive role, and we were eventually to come back to New Haven to get onto the LCTs, as they were called, to take it across to assault the coast of France. We spent quite a bit of time at New Haven in a defensive role.
That's right, yes, just sitting on the beaches. About the actual crossing of the boat was that we went to New Haven, and when we got on the boats, this tremendous gale was on, and we came ashore again, and were made to wash and bath. We then re-embarked and had a rough crossing. I was a bad sailor, and I was sick myself all the way over.
A 5-day gale raged in the Channel, and some troops were cooped up on board ship for nearly a week.
There was, in fact, a very fed-up feeling among the boys, there being little or no entertainment other than to amuse themselves by playing cards for French francs. Rations were cut down to almost nothing, a few mugs of tea per day, and a small quantity of corned beef.
We finally existed on compo rations, and if you remember, we got through to the Christmas puddings.
The 43rd Reconnaissance Regiment rode out the storm opposite Withdrawal aboard the SS Derry Cooney. I was the cook sergeant in the 43rd Recce. I used to go up into the cook's galley, which was only a small place, and I used to have a cup of tea or whatever what was going. Naturally, I was after my own ends, but they were having, you see. On this particular morning, the cook said to me, he was a Scotchman, he said, we said, we're moving. I said, are we? He said, yes. Well, he said, let's have a look. So we both leant over the rail like that. Oh, we're moving. There was a big yellow flash down at the stern of the ship, you see. And that really stunned anyone, like, you know. So we jumped up about twice as high as that. He said, jump. I didn't know whether to jump in or jump up, but I jumped up with him. and skin me knees and things and everything. Anyhow, we got up there. When I looked behind, there was none of the ship left. Half of the ship was gone. And all the people that was on there, all the troops that was on there.
An acoustic mine had exploded under the stern of the ship between numbers 4 and 5 holds.
I don't know whether I sort of flung out of it or not. Throughout all this, we'd continually had boat drill. And my boat station was on the half that I see was sinking. And the last thing I can remember was trying to get to this half of the ship and couldn't. Well, of course, I suppose when I moved, I just stepped into the water.
And I ran along the deck, as long as this skinny, and I woke the sergeants up, kicked them, get up, for Christ's sake, get up, you know, give them a good... What's the matter? I said, half the ship's missing, what are you talking about? And it's the gospel truth.
When the roll was called, 34 men of the 43rd Reconnaissance Regiment failed to answer their names. 189 of them were dead.
The remainder of the division went ashore between the 22nd and the 26th of June, and owing to the delay caused by the storm, marched straight from their assembly areas to the battle line.
I remember thinking it was a bad start to the campaign when we landed in water nearly up to our chests in water, and had to march inland in soaking wet clothes. And although we were nowhere near the enemy, having been sick and having got thoroughly wet, it was a difficult start to this particular campaign.
We landed late one evening, and I remember one particular thing about this. 2 young naval officers landing the craft, said we'll drive it right up, and they did. So we didn't have a wet landing after all, which we expected. You see, all the vehicles was waterproof.
He was a lieutenant on this landing craft, and he said, well, he said, that's as far as I could take it. He dropped the front of this landing craft, and we got to the end. I thought, Christ, there's water there for about 2 miles, and water all around us. And we jumped, and we had about 18 inches of water. I thought, what a relief, instead of coming up around here, like.
All that happened that night, we drove up into a park, about a mile inland, and made ourselves comfortable for the night. Next day, we were briefed, of course, for this advance on Shoe. That's when the fun started.
We were told to go up to the crossroads and make a short turn right, and then proceed down into the village of Sher, where we could recce the positions that the battalion would have to take up. Of course, the crossroads are in such a state that one couldn't really recognize them as a crossroads, except that they were being constantly shelled, as most crossroads were. When I arrived, the signal officer said to me, now there's no enemy in front of us, Sergeant Grigg. They're all the way on the right over there.
The following day, it seemed to be very peaceful, and the sun was shining. And I think it was about midday when all of a sudden, down the road on my left, came a DR on a motorcycle and a large German Panther tank.
I was sent forward to pick up my mortar position, and having found a very good position, looked over a bank and saw a tank with a big black cross on. Realized then it wasn't one of ours, and he was proceeding in the way that my vehicles was coming up. The tanks came down the road and firing right, left, and center. But then they were milling around, and I looked out around the corner of a wall and could see 2 or 3 of them. Decided to get the Piat from one of my vehicles. Fired a couple of rounds at him. Seemed to hit them all right. And we crept up a bit closer and put a couple of bombs through the turret, which seemed to brew them up. They caught fire anyway. There was one got away, but somebody got that one eventually. I don't know who. But we finished up with knocking out the whole 6 and got most of the crew prisoners.
In the middle of all this, rather funny thing happened was the signal sergeant came up to me and said, oh, there's a bit of a battle going on, Sergeant. I think the best thing we can do is brew up tea.
And that's where we lost Colonel Lathaway. That's where the 5 German tanks came in. Enemy tanks were destroyed. There were 6 actually came in. 1 got away, and there were 5 destroyed. I remember at the time that My first job was to go and collect the dead and how to bury them all at the churchyard in the Shire itself. In 32, I buried an old in that grave. That was the commanding officer and Captain Code with a batsman and other people.
By the last week of June, the 21st Army Group held a bridgehead some 40 miles long by 10 miles deep, stretching from Caumont on the right to the mouth of the River Orne northeast of Caen. General Montgomery's strategic aim was to attract the bulk of the German forces into the British and Canadian sector, so that the Americans could overrun the Cherbourg Peninsula.
At the end of June, after a week of heavy fighting and repeated German counterattacks, the 43rd Division were established in a salient across the Odon River, which extended from Verson on the fringes of the enemy-held Carpiquet aerodrome to Baronne, astride a precipitous wooded gorge known with good reason as Death Valley.
Yes, this valley, which we could term Death Valley, which from the name it's obvious, in there we had lots of moaning minis, the German batteries fired at us. And I must say the noise was real frightening. One cannot really describe it.
I was digging in, we had been in there about 2 hours. I was digging my slit trench, and all of a sudden we heard this noise coming through the trees. It was a woo, 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 and my commanding officer looked at me, and I looked at him, and he said, "What's that?" I said, "I don't know, sir, never heard it before," but we soon knew, and that was the moaning minis, the Nebelwerfers. That was the multi-barreled mortars, and I've never in my life heard a sound like it before or since. I think that was the most terrifying noise a man could ever hear in action. It was the moaning of the Nebelwerfers.
Cherbourg fell to the Americans on June the 26th. Caen was stormed by British and Canadians on July the 9th, and the following day the 43rd Division advanced to the assault of the sinister Hill 112.
The start line for the division's attack was a road just south of the Odon, running from Fontaine-et-Toupfort to Baronne. At dawn on the 10th July, the attack went in. On the right, 4th Wiltshire, 4th Somerset Light Infantry, and 5th Wiltshire advanced across the 2,000 yards of open cornfield towards the Calvary on the top of Hill 112.
Before we advanced on Hill 112, the divisional artillery, they laid down a barrage, and it amounted to about 43,000 shells that day. But Jerry was still there when we got to the top.
Well, I can remember the start off. We were lined up on the start line, and the tanks were all in formation, with the infantry between them. And we went forward with the tanks firing their Visas at the way in the corn, and it looked quite picturesque to see us going up across there. First go off, but as we got farther on, of course, we found that the corn was hiding lots of opposition.
When we found any of our fellows that had been killed, the rifle was turned up and the bayonet stuck in the ground so as they could find where the bodies were. That's always been in my memory ever since.
We carried on, and we reached our objective, and the tanks and the gunfire ceased. But Mr. Lowe and D Company carried on over the road, and then we met 2 rows of Spandos. It was here that we were halted, and we then had to retire back to behind the road, having lost half our company.
By midday, the Somersets and Wiltshires were pinned on the line of the road which runs along the brow of Hill 112. Meanwhile, on the left, the 5th Dorsets were moving against the Chateau de Fontaine.
We advanced on, eventually reaching our objective, but we were menaced by a lot of snipers. And some of these snipers, we found afterwards, were tied to the top of trees. And as they were eventually shot, they hung there.
By 6:30 that summer's morning, the ruins of the Chateau de Fontaine were firmly in our hands. 4th Dorsets then took over the advance, moving through the Brest High Corn onto the village of Etterville.
I remember being amongst a lot of stragglers from other companies. We weren't quite sure what to do or where the other troops were, so I gave the order to dig in, and we dug in with our entrenching tools, which were pretty useless, and I remember seeing chaps dig with their bare hands to dig in for their dear lives' sake. I always think that perhaps the bravest thing on this day was by the Padre, knowing fully well that our own medical officer was overworked dealing with the wounded, and he took a Red Cross flag and walked straight up the road into the German lines, and much to our amazement, he came back with a German medical officer to attend to the German wounded.
At 8:15 a.m., the 7th Royal Hampshires were ordered to advance on Maltot, a village close to the Orne River, about 1,000 yards south of Etterville.
We went forward with the idea of passing between 2 battalions of the Dorset Regiment onto Maltot. We managed to get into Maltot, but we didn't manage to stay very long.
I, with others, were pinned down in a cornfield. Very heavy machine gun fire. Every time we tried to move, brought down a hail of machine gun bullets.
We went into a house nearby. We were very surprised to find some French civilians still living in the house. Mother was going around trying to cook some lunch, and we asked to borrow one of the carpets to take this wounded soldier back. So after a lot of persuasion, they managed to let us have this carpet. Shortly after that, we were told to withdraw, and they unfortunately had to leave a section of chaps that were sent out to try and destroy a German machine gun that was trained down the main road, taking quite a lot of casualties. These chaps noticed that we were leaving them. Quite naturally, they were extremely unhappy to see us just pushing off and leaving them.
Owing to a wireless breakdown, it was some time before the serious situation in Maltot was realized, and early in the afternoon, 4th Dorsets were ordered forward from Etterville.
We went in with a bugle, and as the bugle went, we all advanced, all the battalion, and we went through this cornfield, and the machine gun fire, it was terrific, and I can honestly say that I know that bullets went through my arms and through my legs. And we had tanks. I remember these tanks coming up by the side of us, and woof, woof, woof. They just went out like that, all a lot of them. And we had to get down in this corn, and the Jerrys, they moved it, and you could hear the blokes getting hit. It was really awful. And then the bugle blowed again, we all got up, and you look around and, my God, half the blokes missing. It goes on a little bit farther, advance about 15 yards, and we got to get down again. The next thing, the bugle goes again, and we get up, you look around again, my God, there's none hardly left.
The attack on Maltot was rather a disaster. In fact, A Company was lost to a man, mostly captured, there were a terrific number killed and wounded. But as we were pinned down in the cornfield, we were all pretty scared to lift our heads above the corn. And I remember chaps putting up their steel helmets on the end of a bayonet to draw the enemy fire. I remember turning round to the regimental sergeant major and I said, Sergeant Major, can you put me in the picture as to what's happening? And he said, how the hell do I know? At this stage, things are pretty chaotic. I said, okay, well, we'll find out sooner or later, I suppose. And then we had the order to withdraw.
We were told to withdraw to a hedgerow just outside the village. And while we were there, the Lieutenant Colonel was wounded, and we were getting a lot of casualties from a sniper further up the hedgerow. And there was an artillery captain with us, and he yelled out to me through the gunfire, "Hey, you with goggles, get up there and get rid of that guy."
We got the order that the battalion was to withdraw out of Maltot, and when we started moving back, we found the Germans were firing at us from behind. And the tanks were Churchill tanks, quite a few of them were blowing up, which means they were on fire.
Churchill flamethrower moving up beside the edge, and they came up against a Tiger tank, and they couldn't have been more than perhaps 30 yards apart when they saw each other. And the Churchill, with his flame gun, he brewed the Tiger up, and the Tiger with his 88 brewed the Churchill up. Yeah. And they were both knocked out. It's the closest set they were.
Yeah. We go down, and then it was every man for himself to crawl out. I got wounded, I got hit 3 times. At that action, there was 84 men and 7 officers left.
The situation was now very serious. It was clear that neither Maltot nor Retteville could be held while they were overlooked from Hill 112. In mid-afternoon, Major General Thomas committed his last remaining battalion, the 5th Ducal Colonel's Light Infantry, to an assault on the summit.
I remember that there was an issue of mail on the start line. Time was short. Much as one wanted to read one's mail, we had to leave our mail unopened, not knowing whether we'd be alive a bit later to read it.
The attack went in under cover of smoke, across a very open cornfield, grass fields, through an abandoned orchard to a small copse known today as the Bois de Cornouailles, Cornwall Wood.
About 40 yards away from Hill 112, we were enfiladed from the left with German machine guns. He badly mauled us, putting out of action, killing and wounded all officers, 2 sergeants, and 2/3 of the company. I then ordered the company to tighten their belts as we were going in straight away.
I was a motor sergeant on the 112. Well, I should never forget, going forward, I had to go about 700 or 800 yards up over the top of the hill to one side. Got about halfway, and it seemed like the whole German army opened up with everything they'd got. Well, there was no cover. I thought, should I crawl? Well, I'd never get there like that. I'll keep walking. And I could see the tracer about in the eye. I knew that I was only 1 in 4. I was bound to get before I get very far. I couldn't get very far. I kept walking and walking, and got down to the position, much to my surprise.
So anyway, we were in this here trench, and I think it quieted down a bit, a little bit of mortar fire and that. And, well, leading on to what happened. Oh, I know. I was doing a little bit of singing, I believe. I was singing to myself. I suppose, something to satisfy the mind a bit. And, of course, some of the fellas said there, they said, argue him, I thought, entertaining the troops. Up here, front line. Well, you don't realize these things, you just do it, and that's that.
We were there all night, and then the following morning, it seemed to be like hell let loose again, because being on a pinpoint position, he was throwing down upon us everything that he really had.
How many counterattacks were repulsed, one doesn't know. But they were most frequent. And in an effort to stave these off, tremendous reliance was placed on our excellent gunners. Our commanding officer, Colonel James, was killed directing artillery fire from a tree.
Despite every effort, the position was now desperate. The battalion's anti-tank guns were out of action. Most of the officers and NCOs had fallen. Ammunition was almost exhausted. Only about 20 men survived in each company. Reluctantly, the order was given to withdraw to the line of the road. The wounded had to be left behind.
July 1944, the 35th day of the Battle of Normandy. On the right of the Allied beachhead, the American First Army was regrouping after overrunning the Cherbourg Peninsula. On our other flank, the Canadians at last held Caen. 4 miles southwest of the battered city, the fighting still raged around the unobtrusive yet vital feature of Hill 112. For 18 hours, the 5th DCLI had held a small copse right on the crest of the ridge, until the rifle companies were reduced to 2 officers and 76 men. Late in the afternoon, the position became untenable and the order was given to withdraw. It was impossible to evacuate the wounded.
Because I was left there at the time. Well, they were on the move. They were moving back, actually. Because I was actually left up there with between 2 fires then, because they were mortaring well between one another. And I thought to myself, well, I don't fancy stopping here on my own, because I put a couple of tourniquets on my leg, one on each leg at a time. I used my lanyard for that. Maybe the lanyard was protect the knife. I used that to stop a bit of the bleeding. Of course, things are numb at that time, see. So anyway, I thought, well, a little bit of belly crawling here, so I did back to it farther back. Well, a funny thing happened there. There was a Brenton carrier came out of the woods that was just to my right, as I was laying there, a little bit ahead of me. So I shouted to him. And the funny thing about that was, it was one of my own school pals. But the very few that was in the battalion at the time. A fellow by the name of Ross. I lived quite local to myself. And he picked me up, of course, back then and...
Well, during this lot, I saw our fellas going back over the top of the hill. All the lot. Well, this anti-tank officer came along. I said, what's on? Oh, he said, they're withdrawing to the top of the hill. I said, well, what's my position? I said, my orders was just to come down here and fire. He said, I don't know anything about that. I said, well, you give me some orders. Well, yes. He said, when everybody's clear, you go back. I said, right. Kept firing. Everybody disappeared. Kept firing. Nothing from the Germans, you see, because there was so much going down on them. I remember my last order now was 10 rounds, repeat. Rapid, this was. Packed up my set, which is where I made a mistake, and started walking back. Well, I'd got perhaps 300 yards, all these, all gone quiet again, you see. I suppose they popped out of their trench, and so probably saw me. They bound me over it because I was on top of the hill. Everything opened up under the sun again. I kept going again. So what I do once, I could do again, perhaps. Never got out again. And got back. And I should never believe that anybody could walk through so much fire and not get hit. It's really remarkable.
We were being sniped by some German Tiger tanks at about 2,000 yards rise, and they had caused quite a number of casualties, including one company commander who'd been killed. I had under my command, as it happened at that moment, some 3-inch mortars which fired phosphorus smoke, and I engaged these German tanks with phosphorus smoke in order to revolve their turrets. they had to compress air, and they had to take air into their tanks in order to live. And on this occasion, they took in phosphorus smoke. As soon as they took in the phosphorus smoke, the crews hastily bailed out. And when I engaged them with 25 pounders, and although I didn't neutralize the tank, I neutralized the crews.
In every house there was an enormous barrel of this Normandy cider, and the chaps were filling up their water bottles no end. And after they'd drunk gallons of this stuff, we had an order to say that it wasn't to be touched because it was all poison. Well, we were due for it. We had so much of it that we'd had it.
This question of, in the heat of battle, when so much was going on, I mean, you didn't conform to any office hours. The battle went on day and night, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Sunday. You didn't know the date anyway, or what day of the week it was.
You just learned to carry on, and you just went on automatically. And the same with food. You weren't worried whether your food come up or not. You just waited and waited, and then when your food did come up, well, you really enjoyed it more. But you could sleep anywhere at most times. Sleep against a blade of grass at times, it seemed, but we just still carried on.
Dust was a problem with us. It was, while it was dry, the vehicles used to churn it up, and everything was white. It was just like Christmas. In fact, all the vehicles and faces were dust all over, and everybody was choking, and we had to use our handkerchiefs in some cases to keep the dust out of our mouths and nose.
In Normandy, the stench from animals which had been dead for several days and lay bloated in the fields, and of course bodies which were buried just beneath the surface, became terrific.
Oh gosh, yes, that was a bad thing. You couldn't do very much about that. I know there was one particular place, Colville that was, there was a whole field there, about 3 acres I suppose, and there must have been 40 cows dead there. We weren't a living thing. Horses as well.
I remember coming across a tank once, and on the side, you know, where they used to get out and walk along, just over the tracks, there was 2 sets of feet, just the feet only. No, nothing else at all, just 2 sets of feet. No boots on them, just sort of glued to the iron, you know.
And there was a platoon, I know, went out on patrol, led by Corporal Pope, remember that?
Yeah.
And nothing was heard of that platoon. I don't know what happened to that. I don't think they were ever taken prisoner or anything. We just don't know what happened. Another vivid memory, I'd always remember, I still do, was a fellow of a corps that was attached to it. I saw him turn green with fear. Just absolute green as grass.
On July the 22nd, the Somersets and the Wiltshires finally stormed the village of Maltot, taking 400 prisoners. The village was a shambles, and the dead of the Dorsets and Hampshires lay in heaps where they'd fallen 10 days before. 2 days later, on the 25th, the division handed over Hill 112 and withdrew for their first rest since landing in Normandy.
In a month's continuous battle, this untried West Country Division had fought to a standstill the seasoned troops of the notorious Nazi SS, many of them veterans of the Russian front. But it was hardly the same division that had come ashore a month before. In its baptism of fire, the 43rd Wessex had suffered higher casualties than any other division in the British forces. 8 commanding officers were dead. Nearly 2/3 of the regimental officers were casualties. The division had lost almost half its fighting strength. It was said of the 4th Somerset Light Infantry that Colonel Curtis's battalion went up Hill 112, but Colonel Lipscomb's came down it. And much the same could be said of almost every other battalion in the division.
If you got the sort of feeling that we got when we came back from 112, it was, I think, in the air for about 24 hours as to whether or not we were actually going to survive as a unit. We'd had so many casualties that we were all rather worried that we were, after all, territorial battalion, and most of us had been through everything right from the start of 1939 when the original recruiting drive was on, and we didn't want to be broke up if we could possibly help it. We'd lost 2 COs and a good half of the unit, and we were afraid at that time that we were going to be disbanded.
At the crossroads on Hill 112, opposite the crucifix so many of us remember, there is a memorial to the 43rd Wessex Division, where we first went into action and where more casualties were suffered than in any other battle.
The inscription reads, "This memorial is erected on the site of the first major battle in which the division took part, July the 10th to July the 29th, 1944, when this ridge, Chateau de Fontaine, Etterville and Maltot were captured and held."
The price was high, but it was not paid in vain. Montgomery from the start had planned to draw the panzer divisions, the real hitting power of the German army, onto his left flank around Hill 112, so that in the end the Americans could break out towards the Seine. Now the climax of the battle and victory were in sight.
This is an Emmy, the television equivalent of the celebrated Oscars awarded by the American film industry. Its full title is the International Award of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. The Academy is an American society which each year presents awards for outstanding contributions to television. In the past 3 years, the Emmy Award has been won by Granada Television of England, by Radio Télévision Française, and by the Canadian Broadcasting Company. This year, there were 46 entries from 28 broadcasting companies in 16 countries. The winner is Westwood Television, with part 2 of Wyvern at War, Breakout. Wyvern at War tells the story of the 43rd Wessex Division in World War II. Some of the veterans who made that story and those that produced the programs are celebrating the winning of that award tonight. There is John Oxley, Westwood's program controller and executive producer of Wyvern at War. His was the original idea. One night, following a holiday with his family in Normandy, he was on the ferry halfway between Cherbourg and Southampton when he remembered that the Wessex Division had fought over the countryside he had just visited. So, the project was started. Westwood contacted the Ministry of Defense, and Colonel David Rooke and Major Wilson Brown were consulted. Colonel Rooke had commanded the division's 7th Battalion, the Royal Hampshire Regiment, at the end of the war. They provided every sort of special facility, from access to the 6 million feet of film in the archives of the Imperial War Museum to a list of potential advisors and writers. Head of this list was Major General H. Assam, CBE, DSO, MC, author of the divisional history and commander of 214 brigades throughout the European campaign. General Assam became our military advisor. Next, Willoughby Gray, a writer and researcher with a military background, was asked to write the script. Gray leapt at a chance, for he'd been attached to Wyvern in 3 of their major battles. The Ministry of Defence also put us in touch with Major Peter Clare, Public Relations Officer of today's Wessex Brigade. He took on the gigantic task of tracing and assembling the veterans of 43 Division who were to form the backbone of our story. Roger Gage was appointed producer and director of the enterprise, and the first script conference determined the title of the series, Wyvern at War. The story would be told as far as possible in the words of the fighting men of the division, and tonight some of the scores of Wyvern veterans who recorded their experiences for the series are drinking the health of the Wyvern. No one who served under him will ever forget General Sir Brian Horrocks, least of all the Wessex Division. He was, you might say, the division's war godfather. And it is fitting that he, who has since become known to millions on television, should introduce this re-showing of our tribute to the men of the 43rd Wessex Division.
On the 1st of August 1944, I arrived at Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters in Normandy to take over command of 30 Corps. As always, he took me straight into the map lorry to explain the situation. Now, I want to show you very briefly on the map what he told me. He reminded me that the D-Day landings had taken place on the 6th of June here. The British and Canadians on the east, the Americans on the west. And after 8 weeks fighting, the front now was roughly like this. He then went on to say, throughout this battle, I have always continued to attack with the Canadians and the British here on the eastern part, so as to draw the German reserves, and particularly their tanks, over here, and thus enable the Americans to break out, capture the Cherbourg Peninsula, and the whole front will then hinge like that and move up towards the Seine. And he said, that policy is now beginning to pay off, because today 14 British and Canadian divisions are opposed by 14 Germans and 600 panzers, while on the American front, 19 American divisions have only got in front of them 9 German and 120 German tanks. So the breakout has started. But he said, before we can really clear anything, we've one nasty nut to crack. Mount Parcel. 1,200 feet high, this mountain dominates the whole of Normandy countryside around. And that, he told me, is the job of your corps. Now, facing Mount Parcel was the 43rd Wessex Division, which I'd never met. But they had a reputation of being one of the best trained divisions in the British Army, because their divisional commander, General Thomas, was a very good trainer and a good soldier. Mind you, not an easy man. As a matter of fact, the first time we met, we had a flaming row. But the more I saw of him in battle, the more I came to admire his military qualities. Now, the 43rd, though, had had some very hard fighting and had very heavy casualties, particularly here at Hill 112, where they'd lost a lot of officers and NCOs. I got in my jeep and went down to see them. It was a hot, sultry day. The men were in their shirt sleeves. They were obviously very tired, and they were advancing slowly against considerable opposition through this difficult, thick-hedged bank country called the Bocage, much more suitable for defense than attack. 4th, 5th, 6th, the advance continued slowly, and I thought to myself, this is going to be a very long business, because Mount Parcel is very strongly held. But then on the night of the 6th, as I drove back into my headquarters, I suddenly saw my chief of staff running towards me. Very odd, I thought, you know, because senior officers in the British Army don't run much. They're not the runny type. And when he got within a few yards of me, he shouted out, "We've got it, sir." I said, "Got what?" He said, "Mount Parcel." I could hardly believe my ears. Now, what had happened was this. The 43rd had got right up to the foothills, and then 2 troops of tanks belonging to the 13th, 18th Hussars, who were cooperating with them, had found a narrow track winding up to the top, which was apparently undefended, and had set off. A few minutes later, we heard on the wireless that they were on the top, but they were feeling very, very lonely, because there was a thick mist up there, and they could hear Germans all round them. But my chief of staff assured me that Colonel Lipscomb of the 4th Somersets and Colonel Luce of the 4th Wilts had galvanized their exhausted battalions into action and were now flogging their way up to the top. And there they got that night. So Montpinçon, the key to Normandy, was in our hands. And as the battle went on, you know, I got to know those Wyverns very well. And whenever there was tough fighting, there they always were. I ended up being very fond of them. So fond, in fact, that I've now moved down to the West Country myself, where I hope to end my days rather like an old horse put out to grass. And the grass in Normandy, the grass in Somerset, is very, very good. Now those were the opening moves to this program which won an international award. The Wyvern at War Mark II, the Breakout, which you will all see in a few minutes' time.
Wyvern, an imaginary heraldic beast with the head and 4 feet of an eagle and the wings and tail of a dragon. The battle standard of Wessex since the time of King Arthur 1400 years ago, and the battle sign of the 43rd Wessex Division today.
This is the story of the Wessex Division in World War II, from June 1944 to May 1945. It will be seen sometimes as it actually happened 21 years ago, sometimes in the drawings and sketches of men who were on the spot, and sometimes as the scene appears today, 21 years afterwards.
The story will be told as far as possible in the words of the men who were there. Men from Cornwall and Gloucestershire, Wiltshire, Dorset and Worcester, Somerset, Hampshire. Men of all arms then and of all walks of life today. A typical territorial infantry division, 17,954 men from the West Country, organized into 3 brigades, each of 3 battalions. On the 6th of June 1944, D-Day, British, Canadian and American forces had landed on the coast of Normandy. The 43rd Wessex Division came ashore on D+18, and they plunged straight into action at Hill 112 southwest of Caen, where General Montgomery planned to hold the bulk of the German armies and so speed the American assault in the west. On July the 25th, the American armies in France launched their offensive against the key town of Saint-Lô. This was destined to be the breakout from Normandy. The breakout of the Normandy bridgehead, the famous right hook which sent the Germans reeling back towards the Seine.
July the 25th was also a red letter day for the Wessex Division, for on this day they left Hill 112 for good. A month of continuous fighting had centered around this inconspicuous yet vital feature, and in their first action almost half the infantry of the division were killed, missing or wounded.
Hill 112 was a scene of very, very heavy fighting, and to my mind it was a testing time for the division, which went out in a wonderfully teed up, well-trained form, and it was dreadful to see so many wonderful men lost.
Sergeant Major said we wanted some volunteers to go back into the village and find us some drinking water. Well, this we did rather reluctantly because all the shells were conveniently going over the top to the village. On our way back, we were shelled by these minis. One came very, very close and made a hole in my bucket. I was hunting around to try and find something suitable to save this precious water because we carried it rather a long way. And another shell came over and landed behind me. If anybody asked me where I was wounded, I'd first say it was in Normandy.
We had 242 casualties on 112. 93 were killed and buried there on 112. And that's why they decided afterward to call it Cornwall Hill.
43rd Division withdrew into a rest area east of Bayeux, looking forward to a week or 10 days out of the line.
We were told that there was a mobile bath unit in the vicinity, and everyone was ordered to wash themselves under this system. I always remember the rather funny part that there was an NCO issuing shirts and pants and so on, and outside the other end of this bath unit, everyone was swapping shirts, the long and the short and the tall, so that the short people never had the long shirts and the tall people never had the short, and so on.
And then saw a film show, one of the, very old, out-of-date film show, where everybody was happy because there's a few English words being spoken, a few girls in it. And then, that's where we tried our first French beer.
We saw George Formby's show here.
Oh, that was...
George Formby appeared on the scene while we were back resting.
That was in a rest area after church. That was between church and Mount Pincon.
But it was only 3 days before the Wessex were ordered into battle once more, for the Americans were now breaking out at St. Lo, and in the words of General Montgomery, we were now on the threshold of great events.
Three infantry and 2 armoured divisions, of which the Wessex were in the centre, supported by the 8th Armoured Brigade, were transferred to Caumont, the extreme right flank, to speed the American breakout. We were now in the true bocage country.
No one who fought southwards from Caumont that summer will forget the red bocage dust. Everything for about 50 yards each side of the road, trees, grass, hedges, houses, everything had a coppery sheen. And the troops looked like Red Indians on the warpath because the dust had painted their faces this rich bronze colour, and then sweat had cut white channels down their cheeks just like war paint. In fact, the whole countryside is very similar to Devon, and looking towards the moor from Ivy Bridge, say, you might be looking at Montpasson from the Caumont Ridge itself.
We picked up a dead German there that had got the private property of one of our officers we'd lost at 112. So it was the same crowd that moved there at the same time as we had. Lieutenant, oh, I forget his name now, but they'd got his wallet and letters and things on him, you see.
The division's first task was to punch a hole in the enemy defences between Briquissart and Caumont.
We weren't looking forward to this because we were supposed to have air cover, and the clouds was very low that morning. We could almost reach up and touch them. He said, well, we're afraid we won't get any bombers because it's too low, they can't see. We were doing a 10 o'clock start, bombers came over. Just on time. You could almost reach up and pick them down. And they bombed everything under the sun.
At first it seemed as if the hedge-to-hedge slogging match of the Caen sector would be repeated. But then on the Sunday evening the Worcesters broke through to Cohagna, and that same night the 7th Somerset Light Infantry marched across country under a half-moon to capture the important road junction of Pierre-du-Frêne.
The breakout had begun. 4th and 5th Wiltshire went through the Somersets and stormed the wooded heights of the Bois du Homme in a thunderstorm. The Royal Hampshire and the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry carried the advance onto Jerks, 6 miles south of Caumont.
They bombed that as well. Knocked it to pieces. Must have been big bombs because there were tremendous holes everywhere, you know. In fact, there was one particular place, there was a little pond in the bottom, and there was 3 ducks there swimming. I shot one of them with my Sten gun out for dinner.
And there was a hill to go to this village, what was known afterward as Tiger Hill, because there were so many Tiger tanks. That's where Tommy Tucker got killed.
While the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry and the Worcesters fought their way up the long hill south of Jerks, the two Dorset battalions turned east to battle their way through the dense woods which lie between Labine and Onfontaine.
I remember in Onfontaine, the place was a shambles, and there was, in one house, I came across an old lady. She was about 90, I should imagine, but she survived the shelling and she was still alive. Of course, she was quickly evacuated, but she was in quite good shape.
Throughout the 4th August, the division deployed for the assault on Montpasson, known to the troops as the Pinken. This 1,200-foot mountain completely dominates the country for miles around. Since before D-Day, it had been regarded as the main bogey of the whole Normandy campaign.
Montpasson bears much the same resemblance to its surroundings as the Quantock Hills do to the Taunton Vale, and it was likely to prove the Wessex Division's toughest assignment, more formidable even than Hill 112.
The 4th Wiltshire opened the battle, moving against Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, the southernmost of the villages at the foot of the mountain. They lost heavily and were withdrawn into reserve. The following day, the direction of the attack was changed.
3 lanes lead eastward to the mountain off the main Aunay-Danvaux road, and each formed an axis of advance for 1 battalion.
The 5th Wiltshire were on the most southerly, directed on the hamlet of La Verinière. 4th Somerset Light Infantry were in the centre, 7th Royal Hampshire to the north.
It was one of the hottest days of the year, and the troops, when they finally went into action, had shed their battle dress blouses. There were roses in the hedgerows, and back in England it was August bank holiday.
Battalion HQ was situated near enough on the only place we could get was just off of a crossroad. The 4th Battalion of Somerset Light Infantry got to the crossroads and we were pinned down by very heavy fire from the hills. Of course, Mount Pincon was one of these places. It was, you had sort of fields, you had woods, you had very high double hedges, not single hedges, double hedges, where the Hun used to go in between, and they were dug in with their automatic weapons all up there, and they inflicted quite a lot of casualties on the battalion there.
The attack was due to start at 2:30, and there wasn't very much sleep the night before. And as we approached the small stream at the bottom of the mountain, the infantry were held up by machine gun posts which had been carefully and skillfully sighted all along the river, so that, in fact, troops were enfiladed as they tried to cross.
We had been shooting at Germans with the Bren gun from the shoulder, from the back of Black Thorns, and we heard some moaning down in the valley just below us, and as Sergeant Harris and myself, we crawled down the gully through mud and water and came to these boys, and one had his hindquarters shot off and the other had the back of his head shot off. And those boys were not more than 19 years old. Our hands and our knees were bleeding on these blackthorns, and we got them back underneath a carrier which had a trench dug underneath it. I think they were from the Wiltshires. I never heard if they were living or if they succumbed under their wounds.
The commander of the 5th Wiltshires, Colonel Pearson, approached the stream with me and his adjutant and ordered the adjutant and me to stay behind while he went forward to see what was happening. He saw, in fact, that the troops were held up and there seemed no likelihood of any movement at all. So, walking boldly down the road, swinging his stick, he walked, in fact, across the bridge, calling his chaps on as he did so. As he crossed,